Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be doing this. I just want to say going in, this is my very first time doing a webinar, so let's hope that you can teach an old dog new tricks, because this is a first for me. And I am delighted to be here. I understand that this is mostly family caregivers, which is another thing that is really nice for me to be able to participate in, because for 21 years, I worked with families, dealing with family members with dementia. I worked with the Alzheimer's Society of Niagara Region, and we had a family support program where we worked in the homes with families on an ongoing basis throughout the course of the dementia disease. Being family members, you're probably a variety. Some of you will be spouses, some adult children, some perhaps siblings, other family members, and maybe even some of you are friends. Each of you, depending on your relationship with that person, will have a different perspective on the situation that you're dealing with. And also, I'm sure you're dealing with a variety of different dementias. And so that's going to color the issues for you as well. This talk is really to help you have a better understanding of that whole sort of concept of brain and behavior, and how it all interacts when a person has dementia. And so I'm going to start by just giving you a little brief overview of what the importance of the brain is in terms of this kind of circumstance. And clearly, our brains are set up to function in a particular way, and that's true for every one of us, regardless of who we are and what we might be dealing with on any given day. And so really our brain is all that we are. It is everything we think and feel and do is dependent on that functioning brain. So it's the ABC of brain function. It's our affect or our emotions, our behavior, which of course are our actions, and then our cognition, which is our thoughts. And you know, there's a fellow who was actually one of my idols in terms of neuroscience, neuropsychology, Oliver Sacks. And if any of you saw the movie Awakening, that was Awakenings. It was a movie that dealt with a portion of his life. But he was said one day, I heard him giving a talk, and he said, it's our brain that gives us our experience of the world. And I thought that was really quite a profound statement, because it's really true. You know, and if we understand that our brain gives us our experience of the world, then each one of us is going to have a unique experience. Our reality is uniquely our own. And what that really means, though, is that everything we experience is absolutely real for us. And that's true whether we consider that we're sort of functioning whatever normal is, or whether we have something that's causing changes in our brain. Our experience is going to be absolutely real for us. And so, of course, if something's going to change your brain, as it will happen in any kind of dementia, it's going to change how you experience the world. And I think that's a critical piece to sort out. Now, our behavior is really a response. It's the outcome of how we actually experience the world. And not only that, it's also about how we feel about it. Because when you have an experience, there's always an emotional connection to that experience. And when we lay down memories of the experiences we have, not only does the memory of the experience itself get put into our memory store, but also the emotional context of that experience, so that when we re-experience something, we remember the experience, but we also remember and immediately experience the feeling we had when that occurred before. So if it was something that was happy, we feel happy again. If it was something sad, we'll feel sad again, or frightening, we'll feel fear again. And, you know, you can sort of get an understanding of this if you think about yourself and you've remembered an embarrassing moment and you blush again. And I'm sure that you've all had that experience. At least I hope so, because I have it quite frequently. But anyway, the important thing to understand is that our experiences and our memories, our emotions are directly linked. And so when we have changes in our brain, those changes will definitely change our behavior. And of course, since our behavior is response to our experience, we have to understand that, for people with dementia, and clearly this is true as the disease progresses, people with dementia, and I think it's kind of if there's a good thing about having dementia, one of the good things is that they are the only people who, other than perhaps your 3-year-old, they're the only people who truly live in the moment. And what that means is that whatever's going on in this moment in time is what they're actually aware of and what they're responding to. And they're responding to how they perceive what is happening in that moment. And we talk about this as responsive behavior, because every behavior in a person with dementia is really a responsive behavior, because they're responding to whatever is happening in this moment in time. And so I think that that's a critical piece, and understanding also that if we have responsive behaviors, those behaviors may be positive or negative. And I think one of the sad things that's happened today is that when we think of responsive behavior in dementia, it's always related to something negative, and it's something that we're trying to do something about. And I think that that's a mistake. I think we have to recognize that there are good responsive behaviors, and that's what we want to promote. And as we go through this presentation, hopefully that will be captured for you a little better. So I don't know what you understand about the definition of dementia. I'm sure that you've heard many of them, but I think it's really important. One of the things that always used to happen when I was working with this population, with families, is they were always asking me, well, what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? And in reality, dementia is not a disease. Dementia is the outcome, the symptoms, the things that we see, the responses that we see in relation to a brain that's being damaged by some disease process. And so the resulting changes in that brain are the symptoms you see, and that's what the dementia is. So anything can be causing those symptoms. It could be Alzheimer's disease, it could be vascular disease, it could be a Lewy body disease or a frontotemporal dementia. Any of these things would be classed as a dementia. And I think that that's really important to understand. And of course, to have dementia, you must have a change in cognition. So most often we think of changes in cognition as memory loss, but it's really also important to note that every person with dementia doesn't necessarily have memory loss as a presenting thing. And people, particularly people who have frontal dementias, they don't have memory problems at all for a very long time. And but they still would be classed as having dementia because they have changes in judgment and reasoning and the executive functions. And so dementias can capture any number of cognitive changes, but they have to be significant enough that it's causing that person to have difficulties with their day-to-day functioning, so that their functional abilities are changing also. And so to be a true dementia, you have to have changes both in cognition and in the ability to do things. They're not doing things they've always done, and they're starting to struggle with those functional things that have been part of their abilities in the past. And so again, we have to understand why is that all dementia, that all dementias are doesn't matter what the disease is that's causing it, the symptoms are the issue. That's what we call a dementia. So I don't know if you've heard this, but I'm sure that many of you, depending on where you are in the disease process with your family member, recognize that dementia care is very difficult. And in reality, the literature supports the fact that dementia care is the most difficult caregiving of all. And that's true for family members as well as professional caregivers. And to really understand why that is, we have to understand the experience for both the person with dementia and for the caregiver. And I think the focus today is going to be on the issues around the person with dementia. And so what does it mean for a person to have dementia? And I think there's three really important things that we need to understand for that person. And I'll say them briefly here and then explain them a little better. The first is the concept of anosognosia. The second is that everything they experience is absolutely real for them. And I think this is so critically important for us to understand. And then the third thing is the process of retrogenesis. So what does anosognosia means? Well, this really means that they have no knowledge of their illness. And to be honest with you, I think if you don't understand anything else I say today, this is probably the most important thing to truly believe and understand. People with dementia, as time goes on, and certainly in the early stages of the disease, they have a sense that there's something wrong. And they may not be really sure what it is. And certainly if they're still in the early stages and they've had a diagnosis, some of them may be well aware of their issues and their problems. But as the diseases progress, and this is true for all dementias, as the disease progresses, they will be less and less aware that they're having problems. And this is really the dilemma of providing care for an individual who has no idea that they need care or that there's anything wrong with them. And it is the paradox of dementia. You know, they don't know that they don't know. They forget that they forget. And I think it's, you know, keep in mind, they're not lying, they're not denying, they truly no longer have a sense that there's anything wrong with them. And this is due to the damage in the brain. You know, our brain works as a network, and all areas of function are affected when something changes in one place. And so if there's damage to the brain by a variety of different dementias, they damage the brain in different areas, in different places. But because the brain works as a neural circuit, if you have damage to the area of the brain that gives us a sense of our self-awareness, then that is going to change how that person is able to understand that they have any problems. And so I wish I was able to show you in person the brain. But if you put your hand on your head, and I don't know if you can see me here because I can't see myself, but if you put your hand on your head just above your right ear and open your palm, that area where your palm is spread is really the temporoparietal region of your brain. And this is the area of our brain that gives us our sense of self-awareness. And it has to be connected to our frontal lobes to have a really good sense of how we're doing in the world. And this is what gets damaged. And so they no longer have a sense that they have a problem. And of course, if there's nothing wrong with me, then who's got the problem? And I'm sure all of you as caregivers, as the disease has been progressing, that you're starting to get a sense of that. They don't need help. They don't want to be told what they need to do or that they're having any difficulties, because they honestly do not believe that they are. And of course, if you forget that you forget and something's missing, what's the only logical explanation for a missing thing? And oftentimes you'll hear this, you know, they think people are stealing from them. Money goes missing, or papers go missing, or, you know, simple things. I could give you a dozen examples of things that people accuse others of taking from them. Sometimes things that, you know, nobody would really want. You know, I remember one gentleman I visited, and he was all upset because he was convinced his neighbor was getting into his house, and he was in the bathroom looking for the toilet paper. He says, "He's stolen my toilet paper. Can you believe that?" And they really believe that these are the things that are happening to them. And so very, very important to understand that whole concept of anosognosia, because it will impact everything in terms of the caregiving role. The other thing is, because they believe they're experiencing the world through their brain, and their brain is being damaged, and the experience that you're having is your true, real experience. You know, our reality is uniquely our own. And if you don't believe that, just think about eyewitness testimony. If you've seen an incident or an accident, and there's 10 people in the crowd and they're all being questioned, every one of them will give a different perspective on what happened in that moment in time, because we all experience things through our own sensory system. You know, if we have any sensory difficulties, our sensory acuity is diminished, or maybe our vision isn't as good as our hearing isn't as good, then we're going to hear and see things differently than others. If we're emotionally distraught at the time of an incident, that's going to impact on how we experience it. Any physical pain, all those things can influence how you experience a circumstance. And yet, for that person with dementia, their experience is just as real as your own would be in the same circumstance, only they may be seeing it in a totally different way. We really, really, really always have to be looking at the world through the eyes of that person. It isn't what we think is happening that matters. It's what they think is happening, because what we think is happening and what they think is happening may well be two completely different things. And this is the critical piece. Uh-oh, now my thing's not moving down. Okay, so now the third thing is the concept of retrogenesis. And I don't know if you've ever heard this term before, but I absolutely adhere to this theory. This is a theory that was coined by a fellow named Dr. Barry Reisberg, and he talks about retrogenesis as the concept of undeveloping. And you know how in life we go through developmental stages. We're an infant, we're a toddler, we're a child, a youth, an adult, a senior. And what he said, in each of those stages of our life, we go through different developmental processes from the perspective of cognition and function and so on. And so he's saying that as people with dementia progress in their disease, they go backwards through these developmental stages, so that as they're declining in their cognition and function, they're also declining in that developmental process. So what he says, that by the time a person is ready for long-term care admission, they probably are at the developmental stage of a 5 to 7-year-old. Now, that doesn't mean that they're children. What it does mean, though, is that in their ability to understand and interact effectively with the world around them, their behavior may well be like children. Their ability to understand risk, their ability to relate effectively with others, all diminishes as they progress in their illness, because they're no longer as able to sort out the world in ways that they could when their brain was functioning at its normal. And so this is really an important concept to understand, because as you as caregivers are providing care, you will see yourself that you're seeing a change in your need to be more supportive. And a lot of times, and many caregivers would say to me, you know, I feel like I'm looking after my child now rather than my spouse, or my mother is more like my child now than my mom. And so you may be finding some of these changes already, and definitely you will be as the disease progresses. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can go to the website. It's on the bottom of the slide here, and just have a look. And as I say, I really do believe this theory. And I in my own perspective, you know, when I was working with the Alzheimer's Society, over the 21 years that I was there, we worked with over 10,000 families in the Niagara region who were caring for a family member with dementia. There isn't much I didn't see or experience with the families. I learned so much of what I know today from the families and those persons with dementia themselves. So it's I'm speaking from vast experience, and I really, really do believe this theory. Now, to really understand, you know, the concept of what changes for that person, I'm just going to talk briefly about what we call the 8 A's of dementia. And I'll go through each of them individually, so I won't talk about them here one by one on that slide. But the first one, what we've already discussed, that concept of anosognosia. And as I say, this is really the critical piece, because what anosognosia really means is they have no knowledge of their illness. They don't know they have a problem. And, you know, when I talked about them, you know, forgetting that they forget, and accusing others of stealing from them, I don't know if any of you have ever been robbed or had anything stolen from you. But if you think about how you felt when somebody took something that belonged to you, you know, perhaps you've had a break-in, or someone that you cared about has stolen from you, and you feel angry, you feel violated, you feel lots of things. keep in mind that if someone with dementia really believes that they're having that experience, they're going to feel exactly as you did if they feel somebody stole from them. And so oftentimes we'll say, oh, nobody wants your stuff, or nobody's going to take it. And we're dismissing what they believe to be true. And I don't know if you've ever had somebody dismiss whatever you believe to be true, but when that happens, you usually feel offended and upset because you know what you're telling them is right. And your family members with dementia, they honestly believe what they're telling you is true. And so to invalidate it only causes them to be more agitated, more distressed. And so rather than saying that, you can say to them, I know that's what you really believe, and that must make you really upset to think people are taking your things. And then you say, but then you validate in the sense that I'm going to help you, we're going to sort it out. But don't dismiss what they believe to be true as nothing, because that's only going to get them more upset. Always go to the emotion. Validate that you recognize that's their real experience, and that's how they're really seeing the situation. And I'll tell you, you'll see an immediate, sort of diminishing of their distress. So always try to validate. Go to the emotion every time. Now, the next one that I want to talk about is amnesia, and this is really a loss of memory. And we have memories a very complex thing, and I'm not going to go into it all. But other than to say, we have a sensory memory which is unconscious and ongoing, and our brain screens for us all the information that's coming in, and it really only brings the important stuff to our to our conscious awareness. And so that sensory memory that's unconscious and ongoing is always in action. And then we have our long-term memory, which is our long-term memory store for both the things we've learned and experienced in life, and all the things we've learned to do. And these are two separate entities. We have two areas of storage for our memories. One for the knowledge and experiences we have, and the other for the things that we've learned to do over our lifetime. And both of these memory stores are sort of put down in layers. So the first thing you learn or experience or learn to do is at the bottom. And as we progress through our life, the memories that the most recent are at the top. And of course, memory loss is in the reverse order. So the last thing you learned or experienced or learned to do is the first thing you lose. And so they may not remember what they did this morning, or what happened yesterday, or what happened last week or last year, or where they went on vacation 4 years ago. But oftentimes they still have a fairly intact memory, and for a long time, of those long-term memories that we have. And of course, this is really the critical piece in understanding people with dementia, because if sometimes I've heard people say, well, they're living in the past. They're really not living in the past. They're living very much in the moment. And everything in their current environment is they're aware of. The problem is that the only information they can bring to this moment may be 30, 40, 50 years old. And so, for example, if Joe comes down for breakfast in the morning, and he knows it's breakfast and it's morning because the sun's shining and he's having cereal, coffee, or whatever. Then right after breakfast, if he's 30, 40 years back in time, where does he think he's going? And it's probably to work. And so that just makes perfect sense. Or you see your wife or your your mom, and it's starting to get dark out, and smell the food cooking, and she knows that it's almost dinner time. And who does she expect to be at the dinner table with her if it's 30, 40 years ago? It might be, depending on how far back she is, it might be her parents, or it might be her children. And and so these things are real for that person. They're putting the only information they have access to this moment in time. And so, people will say, well, they're delusional. They're not delusional really, because yes, a delusion is a false fixed belief and they really believe it, and it is false at this moment, but it's from a cognitive loss. they're bringing information that they have access to this moment to make sense of it. And so I'm sure you've seen that in many different experiences with your own family member, and it does complicate their world for them, and it often complicates your world too, as I'm sure you've already experienced. Now, the other side of the memory, for the things that they've learned to do, the last thing they learn to do is the first thing they lose. And so as time goes on, they're having more and more difficulty doing things. The first things that diminish are their abilities to do the tasks around the micro, all the push button stuff, the microwave ovens, the, driving the car. Everything now is computerized, and those are last learned things. And so they're starting to have difficulty with the remote controls and that sort of thing. And then as time goes on, they're starting to have difficulties. These are what we call the instrumental activities of daily living: cooking, and if they were your male spouse and they've been the handyman, they're starting to have trouble using tools and that sort of thing. And then as time goes on, they're having more difficulties with what we call the basic activities of daily living: the grooming, the dressing, the toileting, and that's that is that loss of functional ability that we see. Now, our short-term memory has very limited capacity. We can only hold up to 7 items, plus or minus 2. And so without access to a short-term memory, we really can no longer learn. And so it's really important to understand that, because in trying to teach them how to do things, I remember one family said, well, Mom's having trouble using the stove now, so we're going to get her the microwave oven so she doesn't have to cook. And in reality, she couldn't learn how to use the microwave because it was impossible to learn something new. And so we really have to understand that. Keeping in mind, though, that the one thing that's retained is that ability to learn unconsciously, because when we repeatedly do things, over time, we can do them repeatedly and we get better and better at it. The more we do it, the better we get at it. So we want to focus on unconscious learning. And if you've learned anything from a dementiability programming perspective, that is one of the things they focus on. We call that our procedural memory, our motor activities. And those are things that we can support and continue to improve. Now, the next loss is the loss of language. And of course, understanding that language is both speech and comprehension. And each of these losses will vary depending on the type of dementia you have, when they will occur. And of course, for speech, you tend to see speech diminish in people with frontal temporal dementia, whereas with understanding, it's more the Alzheimer's type dementia, that will go first. And so it's important, though, to keep in mind that when language becomes a problem, they can't attend to more than one person at a time. And this is why you'll see them not being comfortable in social settings after a while, because they really can't follow conversations. It's very difficult for them to feel comfortable when a lot of people are talking. And the other thing that they'll often do is, if they're not understanding everything, they fill in the blanks and make sense of what makes no sense. And of course, that's where we often get the concept of confabulation. They're really kind of making up stories that don't seem to make sense sometimes, but they're just filling in the blanks. Our brain is always trying to keep us as functional as we possibly can be. Now, the next loss that we might see is the loss of recognition. And this crosses all your senses. So they don't recognize sounds, they don't recognize visual information, and taste and touch and smell may be diminished as well. And what you'll see is they don't recognize people any longer. And this includes themselves. They won't recognize themselves in a mirror. They might not recognize a current photo of themselves. And this is when you can see that they'll start to have difficulties at home. One of the very common things that happened a lot, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this as spouses, but they'll accuse their spouse of having an affair or being unfaithful, because when they go into the bedroom, there's this other person in there, this other man, if it's your husband, or this other woman, if it's your wife, and they're actually seeing themselves in the mirror, but they don't recognize themselves. This is the other person, the other woman. And mirrors can be very upsetting If it's in the personal space, I had one gentleman who was terrified. In their bathroom, they had a large mirror right across in the shower, and he'd see himself getting out of the shower and would just be horrified at this naked man in his bathroom. And so these are real issues for them, and we need to understand that. They don't recognize current photos of themselves, and so they won't know it's them. And of course, you know, if you're 30, 40, 50 years back in time and you see your old spouse coming towards you, is it your spouse? It might be your parent or your uncle or your aunt or your grandparent. I always remember one lady telling me one day, she says, I was getting ready to take my husband to the doctor and I went and put my makeup on, and she says, and I looked kind of nice, she said, and I came out and he looked at me and he said, oh, there you are. He says, you wouldn't believe that old lady that's been looking after me. And she said, I didn't know whether to kiss him or kill him. But anyhow, these are realities for them. And of course, they also may not recognize objects and what they're for. And that can be a real safety concern. You know, one lady told me that her mother tried to comb her hair with a knife, or she was trying to wash her hair with Tilex. And she says, I don't understand. She can read. Well, yes, she can read, but it's in the bathroom. It's in a bottle. It pours. It's shampoo. And so these are the things that we have to consider, that these are real realities for them. And then the next loss you might see is a loss of what we call our purposeful movement. It's called apraxia, because everything we do has its own motion, and they start to have difficulty initiating the motions that you need to be able to do a task. And they really can't sequence the order of a task. And this is when you'll see them not doing things because they're really not sure how to get started or what steps are involved in the process. And so they're also losing a sense of left, right, up, down, back, front, etc. And they also can lose a sense of where they are in space. My friend who's here with me today, being my moral support here, her husband, he would get lost in the house. And I'm sure you have many of your clients who are, or your family members who are in that situation where they're not always sure where they are and they in space, and they make a half turn and they're lost in their own space. And so these are real issues for them. And then the last major loss you might see is the concept of altered perception. And I think this is really critically important. You know, we take so much of what we're able to sort out in life for granted. We take our brains totally for granted. But they will misperceive things, and there's so they're not recognizing visual information, they're not recognizing sounds. And you know, this is a concern I have around, I saw a lot of this when I was working with the families in the home, where families would tell me that their family member was hallucinating. And because they're seeing people who aren't there, or they're hearing things that aren't there. And in reality, most often definitely people with dementia will hallucinate, without a doubt. But I think very often we misinterpret what they're experiencing as hallucinations. Really, they're what we would call illusions or misperceptions, because they're misperceiving what is there. They're not seeing things that aren't there. A hallucination is there is no stimuli that can account for what they're experiencing. With an illusion, it's there, but they're misinterpreting it as something else. And I've given you a little example here on the screen, because this is a gentleman I visited. And when I was sitting in his kitchen with him, he said to me, you know, those four men are always watching me. And I'm looking around in the kitchen for four men, and I couldn't see anybody. And then he pointed over to the wall, and there were four hooks, and every hook had a jacket and a cap. And those were the four men in the kitchen. And the problem was solved just by removing the jackets and the caps. So please make sure that you're always trying to make sense of what they might be experiencing. You know, the pole lamp in the corner could be a person. The cushion on the sofa might be a person. There's shrub in the garden. One gentleman that I visited, he said that lady in the red dress is always out there standing on the corner. It was the stop sign. And so they will misperceive lots and lots of things. And this is also true for auditory issues, because, you know, a cat meowing might be a baby crying, or one lady I visited, and I happened, thankfully, she'd left her door open. I found her lying in her bedroom. She'd fractured her hip, And she'd lain there since the day before. And she said, you know, I could hear those people laughing and talking all night. Nobody would come and help me. The TV was on in her living room. And so these are realities for this population we need to understand, and always, always, always try to sort out if there's something that might be misinterpreted by them. They also lose color, and so hues are not as bright. And of course, as the day progresses, they're more tired, but there's also this sense of shadows that comes along. And we talk about the sundown syndrome, where they get more agitated in the later uh, hours of the day. And this is a real thing that occurs, and it can be distressing because they are having more difficulty sorting things out. And so this could be your reality as well. And then the other thing, and this is critically important to understand, there's this loss of depth perception. And our depth perception is our ability to see in 3 dimension. When you lose your depth perception, you're losing the ability to judge how long, how wide, how deep things are, to see around things and behind things and under things. And they're really having difficulty doing that. And so what happens is their world becomes 2-dimensional. And of course, in a 2-dimensional world, wouldn't it then make perfect sense that everybody on TV is in the room? And they'll think that. I've had so many circumstances where people have misinterpreted the people on the TV as being in the room. One lady was, I don't know how many of you remember Dan Rather, the news announcer, excuse me, but she was convinced Dan Rather was her boyfriend. He came to see her every night at 6:30. And then I had another lady who was terrified because she was convinced her husband had committed a murder because she saw it happen on TV, but it happened in the living room. And she actually phoned the police, and the police came. But of course there was nobody. And she was actually quite frightened of him for several weeks after that incident because she really believed that it happened. And so these are realities that you will see with your family member, depending on their where they are in their disease, depending on the things that they're experiencing in terms of changes in their brain. But all these changes in their brain can result in these kinds of behaviors. And so it's really very important to understand that. And of course, if you don't have depth perception and your dishes and your tablecloth are the same color, where are the dishes? You know, if you've got carpeting on your floor and your stairs that are the same, where did the stairs start? You know, when you're walking from a tile to a carpeted floor, is that a step? You know, that crack in the sidewalk or the gap in the elevator, is it 2 inches wide or is it 10 inches wide? They have no idea. And so these are realities and you'll see them change how they mobilize, change how they sit in a chair. All these things are very real for them and can really impact on their behaviors. Apathy, this is not depression. This is a sense of where they'll just sit and do nothing. They aren't engaging in anything. They seem totally unmotivated. Often it's confused for depression, but they're not depressed. They just really, their brain is not stimulating them to act. And so they're really not involving themselves in things. And if they have the frontal type of apathy, you'll see a person who may end up no longer being verbal. They don't even think to speak. And then, of course, attentional deficits are the last things that will change. And of course, this is could be either of two things. Either they're having difficulty sustaining attention, they can't maintain attention on one thing, and they're very easily distracted, or they might become unable to shift attention and they're just focusing on the one thing all the time. And this is what we call perseverative behavior. So all these things that occur with them are really impacting on their behavior and also on their ability to function. And our goal always is to maintain and retain and maximize their function to the greatest degree possible. And so we want to consider, how do we maximize their activities of daily living, the ADLs? How do we maximize their sensory experience? Because keep in mind, our senses are how we experience the world. If your sensory you know, with aging, we know that sensory acuity diminishes, and so they're not as able to hear and see as well. And I think this is really critically important when you're thinking about your family member too, because if we have a person who already has a dementia and they also have visual loss and they also have hearing loss, then just imagine how complicated their world becomes for them and how difficult it is for them to sort it out. And so we really need to maximize their ability to hear, their ability to see, make sure they've got their glasses on. If they have hearing aids, keeping them in, uh, so that they can be as functional as they can possibly be, because we want to reduce any chance of what we call excess disability, where they seem more impaired than the dementia itself, just because they've got other issues that they're coping with, like sensory loss. And then, of course, we're trying to maximize their cognitive abilities so that we can keep them as functional as possible in terms of engaging and those social connections. You know, one of the things that happens, and I'm sure many of you have already experienced this, where you see a huge loss in the social connectedness. People stop coming. It's probably, from my experience, a dementing illness is probably the most isolating of all diseases, because people just stop coming around. Even family members stop coming after a while. And it was, I always remember one man saying to me, you know, nobody better show up at my wife's funeral, because if they can't come to see her when she's alive, they better not show up when she's dead. And I, you know, it's just, now I think things are changing. I really hope so. We're becoming more aware of dementia. It's more talked about, and we have a greater understanding, and so hopefully there's more socialization involved. But it is a real issue for family caregivers. And so I don't know if you, unfortunately I can't get a sense of all of you today. I wish I could, but I'm sure some of you have definitely experienced that sense of loss. And so, you know, I mentioned briefly dementia building methods. I have been working with Gail Elliott, who developed dementia building methods, teaching for her. And I really have bought into this whole concept, because it really does focus on supporting an individual in what we call a prepared environment. I'm going to talk about that for a moment. Before we finish off here. But what we're trying to do is or create an environment that elicits what we want to see as the positive behavioral responses. We want to see positive behaviors, and actually we're the ones that kind of control the process. A person with dementia can no longer change. They cannot be somebody different. They're experiencing a disease that makes it impossible for them to function as effectively, and it's really difficult for them to adapt in any way to the world around them. So we have to find ways to adapt to them. And we want to maximize their independence to the greatest degree possible. And we want to provide opportunities for meaningful engagement, including that socialization that's so critically important to who we are. I've certainly felt that, and I'm sure many of you have too, with this COVID-19 issue, where we have become even more socially isolated, and it's very, very difficult to, I don't know if it's changed your own experience with your family member. I wish I could find out more about all of you. But anyway, my guess is that probably you found even more difficulties with it being socially isolating in this particular time that we're in. So if we think about the environment, and environment is really what we call a holistic perspective. You know, we have what we call an individual environment, a social environment, a physical environment, and a cultural environment. I'm just going to talk very briefly about each. You know, the individual themselves, we want to help them function at their maximum and to induce positive behavioral responses. We want to make sure that they're able to interact effectively with that total environment. So we want to maximize their functional ability, their sensory ability, and their emotional state. And of course, the more impaired that person might be, the more the environment is going to account for their behavior. And so if they are significantly impaired, that's going to really impact on how they can interact effectively with their environment, excuse me. And so we want to consider the person. You know, I talked already about the sensory deficits. Do they have sensory loss? Let's maximize that. Are they in pain? Pain is a huge factor in function, in particular in an older person. So we want to make sure that we've dealt with any of their pain. How is their cognitive function? Are there things that we need to do to maximize their ability to function within that physical environment from their own cognitive perspective? Are they emotionally distraught? Are they depressed? Are they severely anxious? Because those things also can be a factor in how they're going to behave. And so we want to maximize all of those things for them, and so that they can function at their personal optimum. Then from that physical environment, there's a huge amount of information that's part of our physical environment. You know, from a sensory perspective, it's the lighting, the noise, the clutter. We want to reduce stimuli, and keep in mind that all these things are factors. You know, lighting can alter function in a person with dementia, and can certainly alter behavior, because if there's a lot of glare, glare can be confusing for them. Glare can make floors shiny that look wet and slippery. Shadows can be a huge problem. Shadows can be misinterpreted as scary things, people being in the room. All those things can be a factor with lighting. Noise, they have difficulty with a lot of noise, so we want to reduce any noise that might cause agitation. Clutter being around them so that they can mobilize effectively, particularly if they have depth perception issues. The more cluttered an environment, the more difficulty they're going to have seeing around things and being able to find things. And of course, anything that we can do to reduce those kinds of problems, you want to. Wayfinding, and I've got a little slide to follow here. Wayfinding is a huge issue. And so if they're starting to have trouble finding the place in the home where they, you know, finding their room, finding the bathroom, we can put up signage, finding the clothing, what's in the cupboard. Keep in mind, if you don't have memory and all the doors are closed, what's behind the door? They have no clue. What's in the drawer? They have no clue. And so a lot of what we call rummaging behavior is really them trying to find things because they don't know where they are. And so let's label things if we can, and put signs up that allow them to make their, even in the home, where they can find their way around the home to deal with effectively with their what it is they're trying to do. And then in terms of design, the colors, I can't tell you how important color is, because you need good contrast, particularly for people with depth issues. Contrast allows them to see things clearly. The places you want them to be, make sure they stand out. The things you want them to utilize, make sure they stand out. And making sure that things are as functional for them as possible, and easy for them to see and identify. And of course, the layout and the flooring and all those things are really going to maximize their ability to function and keep them safe, and making sure things are familiar. And I've just given you this little slide here that shows, this was actually our I don't know if you can see this, using the arrow here. In the Alzheimer's Society, where I am in Niagara, we had a little apartment built that occupational therapists set up for us to show families how they could set up their own home. And so you can see here that all the cupboards have labels on them as to what's in them. You know, the drawer handles stand out so they can open them. Labeling things that are relevant for what they might be looking for. The fridge has tape on the handle so they can find the handle easily. Every appliance had a little step-by-step label to show how they could use it effectively on their own. Using the fridge for a menu or a schedule, and schedules can be wonderfully enabling for a person with dementia who's now starting to struggle with their independence, and it helps them maintain their independence by putting things that they can find for themselves to do, to know what's going to happen in the day, and that sort of thing. And then there's examples of wayfinding and labeling on the drawers, and so on. And so these things can be very, very helpful for your family member. And then the social environment, that includes your as family members, friends, care providers, keeping in mind that approach for people with dementia is everything. If there's nothing wrong with me, what the heck are you doing? Why are you interfering with me? And approaching that person in ways that where they feel comfortable. And I don't know if any of you are having the experience yet where your family member doesn't recognize you, but just imagine from their perspective how unnerving it is for them to have what they would perceive to be a stranger. And I have a friend right now who's dealing with that, where the spouse is not recognizing them, and it's a bit concerning. And so you want to reassure them that you recognize that it must be scary for you to think that I'm a stranger, but don't worry, I'm not going to harm you. I'm going to take care of you. Whatever you can do to reassure them is really so important, and to approach always with the intent of being supportive, um, and trying to get them to be as independent as possible is really going to maximize your success, because they want to be independent. And of course, that social environment, that social environment is what gives us the ability to really feel like we're validated, because we get our sense of self from the validation of others. And so we want to have interaction with other people, and keeping in mind that the most dependent are the most at risk for isolation. And as I talked earlier, where that is a huge risk in this circumstance. And also that there isn't a physical environment that's not also a social environment. Now, finally, I just want to say that, from a cultural perspective, this cultural environment is really important. That's the beliefs, the ideals, the customs, the values that we have that are inherent in a family unit. And of course, that person with dementia may no longer remember the family norms or the family values. And clearly relationships are going to change, because that person is no longer able to engage with you in the same way. And the buttons that they used to push that got good responses may not be the buttons that they're pushing now. And so that can really create problems. And of course, the other thing is they may actually forget the cultural and religious beliefs that they once had. And so they may be doing and saying things that they never, ever would have said or done had they been able to be the person that had that fully functioning, intact cognition. So all these things can be really, really impacting on the kind of behaviors that you're going to see in your family member. And I guess for me, the most important thing is knowing that this is normal to the disease process. All the things that you're seeing and that we've talked about are things that are going to happen without a doubt down the line. It may be different for each person. It may be at different times, but this is all just part of a changing brain. And so the more we can understand, the more able we're going to be to maximize not only their well-being but our own, because it's, as I said, it's the most difficult caregiving of all. And I'm sure many of you are already aware that it's very difficult. So I'm going to take some questions now, and I hope that this has been helpful. There's so much more I'd love to say and talk to you about, but this is it for today.